Hello, Glitch Reaper here. I'm back with some more Magic the Gathering with Magic Duels, and I was going to go over some more of the tutorials again. Yeah, I've still got a lot of stuff to go over, and a few little groups at a time would be still pretty much the way I'm going to go with this as I have before. As it just seems to be kind of more the thing to at least try to have a little theme or connection between just a few of them at a time. At least whatever it does. In this case, I've kind of been thinking about it. I want to go over what's a bit above and below, namely a bit of flying and the grave. Yeah, so I'm going to go over flying and reach, as well as a couple things having to do with the graveyard, namely the graveyard exile and graveyard interactions. So I'm going to do a little bit of the above and the below, so to speak. So let's start up with the above, with flying and reach. The thing about flying and reach is very very old when it comes to flying. Reach is something that over time kind of got simplification. With flying, things that have flying can block things that have flying, but they can also avoid things that don't have flying and just be unblocked if something doesn't have an ability that otherwise helps. And that's what reach is for. For a long time, things had a very special statement of can block things with flying, even though they can't offensively use something like flying. So they eventually simplified that into calling it reach, which means basically just that they can block flying, but they can't offensively attack in that fashion. In other words, they can't fly over their enemies, but they can, however, block something that's coming in from the sky. So this is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. You can kind of think of flying as both on attack and block, but you can kind of think of reach as if it had flying, but only while blocking. It's kind of a way of looking at it that's a bit different, but overall, the big thing to know is that things that don't have flying or reach can't block creatures with flying. So you can usually get in a lot of free hits that way. Things that have reach can block things with flying, but again, they can't use it on offense. So they kind of have some interaction with each other in terms of the sky limit of Magic the Gathering. So a lot of things with wings usually have flying. And you'll see a lot of flying in the game. It's kind of surprising I haven't seen as much flying from computer-controlled opponents, but it's probably because they specialize in something else as part of the overall balance of the game. Darn, your lips. Usually cards with more complicated abilities that are mainly based in text and reading them. Usually have fewer, what I guess you could call standardized abilities, which don't necessarily need as much text to describe them, because they've been kind of standardized as to what they do and how they're established and how they work and all that jazz. So, because of that, that means that flying and things like reach and some other abilities are usually squeezed out if something has a lot of text. So this means that, oddly enough, if you're going to have more fancy specialty cards, you might not see flying on them as often. Now, there are, of course, exceptions, but the main thing to remember is if you want to basically just power drive through an enemy by using attacks that they have a hard time blocking, it's good to have a lot of flying creatures. And I have seen entire decks based solely on having a lot of flyers. I try to balance out myself, but you can see how a specialty can be very devastating, or at least you will in a moment. So let's go through with the skill quest. A little lower load speed than usual, but that should be okay.
Some creatures have flying, which lets them soar above the battlefield. Flying creatures can be blocked only by other flying creatures, or by creatures with reach. On defense, a creature with flying can block any attacking creature, either one with flying or one without.
Okay, I think my settings have reset again because that came in extra loud to me this time. So I'll have to check that in a second. But that's not 100% true. just because a creature has flying doesn't mean it can block any attacking creature. So, admittedly, that's an oversimplification. Like, there's plenty of other things that can allow something to be extra hard to block in ways that don't mean flying. Some creatures are just downright unblockable. Like, literally, it just says, this creature is unblockable. Yeah. You can't just oversimplify with that. So, yeah. But yeah, there are some also... there are some flying creatures that specifically say that they can only block other creatures with flying, but that's actually decently rare. Usually if something has flying, it can use it both offensively and defensively, as I said before. But on occasion, you'll find an exception. So mainly it just means that you can block any creature that it qualifies to block, whether it has flying or not flying, as long as it's still qualified to block it in some way. So that's probably the better way to describe it.
Creature cards have icons on the left side that indicate special abilities like flying. Complete this skill quest by surviving your opponent's assault and winning on your next turn.
Okay, this is going to require a little reaction speed. Okay, not as bad as I thought. I need to check my audio settings. It's pretty much the same. It's probably that way that it always amplifies into my gear. So yeah, that's probably it. Don't worry about it. It may seem a little weird that I'm saying that if you're not hearing that part. So, but yeah, either way, back to school. Back to the quest. Okay, so this is definitely a you have to block situation, but you also have to go again with the basics and mind your power and toughness ratings. Now, this creature is a canopy spider. It has reach. It's also a 1/3, so it can be a bit more defensive than it is offensive anyhow. So let's use that to our advantage. Because it has 3 points of toughness, that means it can block something with a power of up to 3, and then anything with trample would still not get past it. But that's not in this situation. Main thing to remember is you can block anything up to a power of 2 and it not even die from it, and you'll still be able to have it the next round. And that's another interesting part of the game, establishing whether or not you are willing to let a creature die in order to just block attacks. In this case, the whole point is to block these attacks that the opponent is unleashing right now and attack the next turn. So, because of the terms of this particular skill quest, you have to use something like this. And it's the idea that you're going to try to make as many of your creatures survive so you can pound your enemies the next turn. So let's see what we got here. Well, this creature is just going to get flattened pretty easily. But this one will be able to block this creature with flying here. Also, another special note about how this game works. Whenever you see a creature on the battlefield with flying, it usually actually, in fact, looks like it's flying on the battlefield. It'll like bob up and down. So that's another part of it. Okay, and see, right now it's having one creature with reach blocking a creature with flying, and one creature with flying blocking a creature with flying. Now this one, however, will just crush this one completely. So we'll have this one will be knocked out on block, but this spider will survive. This one over here, which it even says here on the card that it can only block creatures with flying. So there's my example card there, and that's what this one here is as well. But anyhow, the point is that this, because they're even the same creature, will definitely be a mutual. They will take each other completely out. Now, this one, on the other hand, will survive, because it just has more power and toughness than this creature by a long shot. It doesn't have any special abilities, but in this case, we're just trying to do from one turn to another. So, time to block with everything we got, in just the right way. Goodbye, birds. Yeah, get a forest. But the bigger thing is, it's time to knock out the enemy. Because, well, it's all I can really do because this is a skill quest and they didn't give you exactly what you need. I'm not going to be able to show the offensive flying nature here, but you get the point. Because that's what they were trying to do to me. If I hadn't blocked the flyers and reachers.
Great work. White and blue decks often use flying creatures for an aerial assault that's hard to block.
Yeah, that's definitely an observation. That white and blue decks, or white and blue in general, tend to have a lot of flying creatures. But that's not always the way it is. You can find flyers in other colors. However, green rarely has flying. It tends to, however, have a large amount of reach. So it tends to be decent at blocking flying, even if it doesn't have the ability to offensively use something like that. So that tends to be something about it, as to how it divides. I've seen more than a few black creatures with flying, as well as more than a few, well, I have seen some black creatures with flying, but I've also seen some that are red. When it comes to red creatures with flying, they tend to be either phoenixes or dragons. So with red, it tends to get particularly mythological when it comes to creatures with flying. So it's an interesting trend on that one. However, admittedly, when it comes to the other colors in flying, overall, if you're not playing white or blue, it tends to be a bit more expensive overall to play. So just kind of keep that in mind. Okay, and now I'm going to go to the graveyard. At first, a bit of an additional primer on the graveyard. You've definitely seen things go into the graveyard, as I've described before. But in this case, I'm kind of going to go over a few extra things about how your creatures getting whacked is handled in this game. So, yeah. The graveyard and Exile. The thing is, there used to be a bit of a different way that Exile was handled. Just a moment, I need to sneeze. Sorry about that. I seem to be lacking an ability to do proper cut until further notice because of changes in software. But yeah, as I was going to say, Exile is kind of handled differently in a way than it used to be. It used to be the terminology was removed from the game. Now Exile is treated kind of like a separate graveyard. As I've kind of shown before with creatures dying, or for that matter cards being used up, they tend to go to the graveyard. Well, now there's a separate pile for things that are a bit harder to bring back, and that's Exile. It's, usually you can bring things back from your graveyard with various cards, but it's really tricky to bring something back from Exile. And as I said before, even the phrasing of how this is handled has changed over time. So I'm basically going to go through the skill quest and try to illustrate this a bit more. Because it's Exile is kind of easy to learn, but at the same time, being somebody that's been from the old terminology, to me it's easier to just kind of show it off. Yeah, I think this, for a while I was remembering that this part was more in the other section I was going to show about the graveyard. But this will illustrate the point directly. There are certain creatures that have abilities that can be activated from the graveyard, as well as I kind of illustrated before with Embalm. But that's kind of a very particular case. There are some that have more general specialized abilities that can only be used from the graveyard, from the graveyard. This generally involves bringing it back from the graveyard to play or to your hand, although there may be other things they can use from the grave. Now, the thing is that sometimes this involves exiling either other cards from the graveyard or from somewhere else, or maybe it involves discarding cards or whatever. But basically, sometimes to pay for these special abilities, you have to do that. So this is the special thing about the graveyard, is that it tends to get exiled more than your cards in play from your hand or from your deck. well, library in Magic the Gathering terminology. So basically, if you have something that's dead, out of all things, it tends to get deader because once something's in exile, it usually stays there. So yeah, that's when you officially go in Magic the Gathering. It's dead gem. Uh, so yeah, so the graveyard tends to have that escalation of losing your stuff. That it tends to be the thing most targeted for being exiled. Win the game this turn. Okay. Yep. Hold on there. Wait, is it not doing the thing? Why did it not do the thing? Yeah, sometimes it doesn't let you stop it. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I can see how this is supposed to go. Helpful memory here. Pay 3 and 1 black, exile a creature card from your graveyard, put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield tapped. Well, this thing's probably going to be the one that bites bites the big one. So, yeah. I mean, after all, there's no real reason to sacrifice my other creature, especially when it's the active one. Now, is there? It's the one with the special ability, so it's obviously the one you have to preserve. This is a quick statement of timer. However, in this case, it's doing a special thing. Means, yeah, activate the ability while you can. So I have to be able to work it on my turn. Now note that the creature went to the graveyard first, and then I hit Exile by using this thing's special ability. The Null Caller, which is apparently from Oath of the Gatewatch. Of course, in the actual event, I had to do it kind of quickly. But you'll see what's called a graveyard browser, normally if you have something in the graveyard, or your enemy does, might I add, in this game. But if you try to check it out whenever something's been exiled, there's a couple of different things you'll see. You'll note there's an X on it, and it's grayed out. Normally when a card is in the graveyard in Magic Duels, it's still in full color, and it doesn't have an X on it. So this means, sorry, unless some very unusual circumstances apply, you really can't get this card back. So again, exile means it's a goner. So yeah, under most circumstances that ain't coming back. So this is kind of what it looks like when something's in exile. So it's definitely a bad thing to have to do. But now, it's no longer an issue because by allowing a creature to be sacrificed, and then further sacrificed by being exiled rather than just in the graveyard, I've basically turned my enemy's attack from a fairly decently sized creature and turned it around, because in defeating this creature, which was a 1/3 and therefore only had 1 point of power, that meant that my total amount of power to strike back with in the next turn would have only been 3, because this creature is a 2/4 and this is a 1/3. And again, look for power, you look at the first number. So this would have totaled 1 and 2 for 3 points, which wouldn't be enough to finish off the skill quest and finish up by finishing off my opponent. But whenever I use this thing's special ability, then I called forth this zombie. And this means that because it's a special token creature that already has a power of 2, this means I actually got more attack power by letting that creature die and then get exiled. So I actually turned an opponent's strength into a weakness, because that strong, powerful creature had just wound up making a huge vulnerability for my enemy in my own turn. So I'm about to run them over due to their attack. So thank you, Exile in the Graveyard, for actually doing something good, because sometimes the price is worth it. And in this case, the ability to win the skill quest is worth it, because that's again what we're here for. And as usual in a skill quest, the answer is attack with everything. And yeah, special reminder, don't assume the dead are no longer useful. Well, yeah, because as it says, some spells can even bring them back from the grave. And, hey, if they can't serve you, what good are they? Well, admittedly, I tend to be more a bring them back from the grave than exile kind of guy, but, I mean, sometimes you really do get that extra bit of punch from exiling something. So sometimes it is worth it. But either way, this is a reminder. In this game, dead creatures don't always stay dead. Sometimes, even if they are dead, they get their revenge in some way. So, yeah. Next up. Again, going with the graveyard, with the graveyard interactions, which is what I thought I remembered that one being there for. But this is kind of like what that showed before, with some things only being workable from your graveyard. But this seems to be more the in general set that is saying about how things go into your graveyard in general. So this probably I should have done first, but I kind of remembered this the other way around, so oh well. It happens. Because Exile and the Graveyard are so basic, I kind of thought I remembered that being the lesson that had the basics of it, but oh well.
If one of your creatures dies, it's put into your graveyard. Instants and sorceries are also put into your graveyard after you cast them. Other cards can also be put there, such as cards you discard from your hand. Some spells and abilities can bring cards back from your graveyard.
But yeah, as it was basically saying, sorceries and instants will go to your graveyard because they're basically one use only, and then they go to the grave, indicating that they've been used. When a creature dies, it also goes to the graveyard, and if you discard a card, then it also goes to the graveyard. Discard is something that happens in more than one instance and reason. If you have more than 7 cards, like if you have 8 or more, then at the end of your turn you usually need to discard one. So you're basically limited overall to 7 cards except temporarily. So that's one reason why you might discard cards. Sometimes discarding cards is an additional cost to playing a special ability, and sometimes enemies can force you into discarding cards with spells and abilities. So discarding cards from your hand actually is one of the bigger reasons why things wind up in your graveyard. But rarely, sometimes that might also be forced from your library. So watch out for things that do that. I know I've got a pretty wicked deck that has shredded more than one enemy deck before, so yeah, I definitely know how potent that can be whenever you literally just shave an entire library into the graveyard. Because if you're completely out of cards and you can't draw on your turn, then that's game over. That is one of the basic rules of the game, and I'm just saying that here, that forcing an enemy to discard both from their hand and from their library is a very powerful way to win. You can literally shred an enemy down to nothing. So by simply throwing everything into their graveyard, you can win. And so using the graveyard offensively and defensively in terms of both your own and theirs is a very big part of the game. So just showing the basics alone kind of quickly gets you the idea. But in terms of the advanced, that's something you kind of learn over time.
To complete this skill quest, use your graveyard to win this turn.
And this is basically saying you use your graveyard to win this turn. So, okay, fair enough. And here is another time where it's good to analyze what you got. Because here we have a very powerful sorcery card called Rise from the Grave. You can put a target creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. So that's kind of an additional little twitch with how it works. Sometimes that happens. You may occasionally zombify something. But don't worry, These zombies in Magic the Gathering are usually a bit more intelligent than usual. Now, this card is very powerful because it means you can target an opponent's creature in their graveyard, bring it under your control, and use it from then on, because it doesn't say here that that control ends at end of turn. It doesn't say that they're put back to the graveyard at end of turn. No, it just says it comes under your control. And it's a good time to mention something very basic to that I don't think's in the other parts of the lessons. If something's under your control, but another player is the actual owner, then if it is defeated, it goes to their graveyard, not yours. Just because it's under your control doesn't mean that it's technically yours. It means you have the ability to use it for a while. But if it's defeated, for any reason, if they counter the ability, if they counteract that ability in some other way, if they slay their own creature in combat, or if they or something else happens to it, like maybe you sacrifice it for something else that you need to do, then no matter what, if a creature that is owned by another player dies, but you control it, it goes back to the owner's graveyard. So it's another important thing to know about graveyards, is they are always in reference to their owner, not to the controller of what's going to the graveyard, to their owner. That graveyard is bound to the player, not to just a temporary alliance. Or allegiance, I should say. Now, this particular card is strong enough that it will take all the mana that I'm allotted in one shot, but it will be sufficient because my enemy has 4 points of health left, or life points, and this lightning elemental has two very special qualities. The first of all is, if you look at it, it has haste, so whenever I get it back to the battlefield, even though that would normally treat the creature as if it has first been summoned, that's not going to be relevant here because haste means it can attack immediately. I've mentioned this before. The other thing is it has 4 points of power, and my enemy only has 4 points of life, so it'll be able to cancel them out in one shot. Now, whenever you use any kind of special spell or ability that brings something directly back to the graveyard, the casting cost is irrelevant. That is considered used by spell or ability, is not considered needing to pay for the creature in another way. So if it goes directly onto the battlefield, that's just what it means. It means you don't have to worry about recasting it or anything. It just is there. And that usually means that the spell or ability has to be countered or prevented to stop it from coming back to the battlefield, rather than a normal counter. So that means that these kind of abilities are especially powerful. So let's unleash this. Because I'm the only one with something in my graveyard, it automatically targets mine. Again, remember this thing could theoretically target the enemy's graveyard, as I was saying. And I have done that before. It's actually in the quests that you will get in story mode. And of course, as usual in skill quests, the answer is attack with all. Goodbye. Glad I didn't have to deal with that enormous trampling creature.
Very nice. Just because a card ends up in your graveyard, it doesn't mean that card is no longer of use to you. The color black is especially adept at returning creatures from the graveyard.
And again, here's a special note. It's a reminder that the color black is very good basically at what you consider necromancy, and especially in bringing creatures back from the grave. Now, the thing is that it used to extend somewhat to white, and also to a small extent to green, because green is associated with things like renewal. And sometimes that still happens. But for the most part, your strongest color in Magic the Gathering, if you want to bring creatures back from the graveyard, is black. That is where you will wind up taking a lot of your creatures back and saying, hey, you, rise from the grave and smite my enemies. So if you want to zombify your creatures or just bring them back fully alive, play black if that's your kind of style. That'll be mostly it for now, but I did want to make another little side note. Just a little indication of something I haven't fully shown as much before, but just as a quick note. And that's kind of a little thing about quests. Now, although the game can be played offline, there are certain things that wind up limited when you're not, as I may have mentioned before, and in my basics whenever I was having to start out doing this offline. And you'll note that it says store and I have 10 coins. Well, one way to earn coins is quests, and as long as you're online, it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's a multiplayer type quest or not, just the fact that you can only do quests if you're online at the time. So as long as it's able to connect, then you'll be able to do this. And a lot of these things are things that's pretty easy to do if you know how, or if you just have something styled like that way. Like, sometimes they also have these community things that as long as you contribute to them overall, then they will basically allow you to be considered as getting that little bonus of coins. Like this is saying plus 60 for doing, as a community, doing 100,000 colorless spells. And might add that counts artifacts, not just Eldrazi, which are truly just colorless creatures. So playing artifact is pretty good for doing something like this specifically. Gravedigger, have 10 creatures leave your graveyard. I'd just like to say that whenever something says to do something, often your enemy can contribute to it, whether they're just a random NPC or an actual player, because if it forces that circumstance, it also counts toward your quest. So if an enemy has a special ability that allows them to remove creatures from your graveyard and put them into exile, normally keeping them from being used by you, then that actually contributes to this Gravedigger quest, which you might see more than once. I had a combination of things happen to me on one of my recent duels, where I had a couple of creatures that I personally brought back from the grave with my deck, and several that the enemy exiled. Now, this is saying creature cards specifically, so if they were to have something that generally exiles cards from your graveyard, then anything other than a creature wouldn't contribute to this. Countered down is also like that. If an enemy forces -1/-1 counters on your creatures, it also counts towards this number here, which is about 15. And you'll notice with these quests that the numbers are pretty stable from one instance to another in terms of that exact quest. So they're kind of standardized. Actually, very standardized, really, as well as their worth. Like, these are all worth 80. And might I add, usually it takes about 150 coins to get yourself a new booster pack. And I might show opening one of those at random at some point just to illustrate it as to what that's kind of like. Here we have Brain Drain, discard 20 cards from your hand. And I just mentioned a lot about discard and how it can go from various locations. Well, the thing is, enemies can force you to discard, and you can have sometimes abilities where you have to do that as an extra price of doing something, or sometimes it's because you're using a lot of abilities that have this very common trade-off, where you draw a card and you discard a card. So you basically shuffle your hand around a little. And any time that you discard from your hand, no matter what, that contributes to this particular quest. So again, I just wanted to go over kind of how these things went, because it was kind of an appropriate time, especially with Gravedigger here, and I was just going over the graveyard. So yeah, I just thought that was the perfect time to pop into quests for a moment and show what that's kind of like. But anyhow, this has been Glitch Reaper, and I have been happy to illustrate more of Magic Duels, and for that matter, Magic the Gathering in general. And and a little bit of the history on a few things that's kind of changed their terminology over time and made it a little simplified. So yeah, again, I've been from around some pretty early moments in the game's history, so I have seen a lot of changes. Even the fact that now we have an online version of the game that's free to play is pretty awesome, and from what I hear, there will be another version that's free to play coming up. I really hope they keep maintaining Magic Duels indefinitely in terms of things, because it still has quite a community behind it. Anyhow, this has been Glitch Reaper, and I've been having a good time showing off some more Magic Duels. So I'll be logging off for now. Hope to hear from y'all later, so bye for now, everybody.